Welcome back to the channel, my friends. Warhammer Man Studios. I'm Warhammer Man, and today we're talking about, is Games Workshop doing too much? This video is sponsored by CMO Games. More on that later. Alright, so we have the brand new grot detachment reveals for Warhammer 40,000. Basically 30 different detachments, including a new Deathwatch index, all taking place in the month of December. We're about halfway through the new edition of Warhammer 40,000 10th edition. We knew there was going to be a big shakeup. We recently got a new Munitorum Field Manual, and now in addition to all of the new detachments, which were already going to massively shake up the meta, although most of them weren't necessarily the most competitively viable, more of them were thematic, so probably wasn't going to change things too much. Now on top of that, we have a bunch more changes. So just kind of scrolling down here to the recently updated, this stuff is all recently updated in December. But the main things to focus on are the brand new Munitorum Field Manual. It does have some points changes in there, but the majority of them are either to reflect like a very powerful or like undercosted unit, or changes in the actual rules that have benefited a unit to bring things back into balance. So chances are, if something went up in the new Munitorum Field Manual, the points got more expensive because it got some new rules that make the unit better, or it was already just clearly undercosted and being spammed by those factions. Next, we had the Pariah Nexus Tournament Companion. Got some minimal changes overall, nothing massive here. And then, of course, we have the new Balanced Dataslate. So the Balanced Dataslate is the main focus of what's changed right here, because that's going to affect your general armies and then obviously the core rules as well. As far as core rules, the main two changes were units that could drop outside of 3 inches via Deep Strike instead of outside of 9 inches like you normally would. All of those rules have been changed to 6. So no more dropping outside of 3 inches. Now every instance of the rule where it says you could drop outside of 3 inches is now 6 inches. This means you'll still be able to get close and do some effective and efficient things, but now it will be possible to screen you out, as where before with the 3-inch rule it was almost impossible. Another main change there is that previously, if you had a model on an objective, it was still possible for somebody to deep strike in and still be on the other side of that objective. That is now literally impossible. So no more stealing away objectives with the 3-inch deep strike rule. I think that's overall a positive change. And then next we have the stratagems that worsen armor penetration. So things like Armor of Contempt, previously you activate the stratagem and it subtracts 1 from the AP of incoming damage. Now it's just for the activation. It's not going to last for the whole phase anymore. So previously somebody would shoot at you, you would trigger Armor of Contempt, and then for the remainder of the phase, whether it was a shooting phase or the combat phase, all incoming attacks were going to worsen the AP by 1, which was especially a problem on things with like a 2-up armor save, especially when coupled with cover. But now it's just going to be for that single activation. So if you have 2 units that are going to shoot at a target, they can use the strat. It will affect the first volley of oncoming fire. But then when the second unit or subsequent units target that same unit, the stratagem is gone. And because it's once per phase, it's not like they can just spend another command point and trigger it again. So you'll still be able to use Armor of Contempt multiple phases in a single turn. You're going to have to pay the command points for that. But each time you activate it, it's only going to affect 1 oncoming unit's damage. So while it'll still be good, it'll still be effective, it is massively, massively weakened. And then from there, we have a bunch of faction rules changes. Now, some of the factions got no changes at all. Other factions got a ton of changes. We're just going to look at a couple of the key ones that are really going to affect things. So the Adepta Sororitas first. Now, instead of gaining a miracle die at the beginning of every turn, so your turn and your opponent's turn, you're just going to gain 1 miracle dice at the beginning of the battle round. So instead of gaining 10 miracle dice throughout the game just from this rule alone, you're now only going to gain 5. That was actually the suggestion that I had made months ago, so I think that's a good one. And then next is, at the end of each phase, if 1 or more Adepta Sororitas units from your army were destroyed that phase, you gain another miracle die. So previously, it was whenever a Adepta Sororitas unit was destroyed. So if you had like a 5-girl unit and then also a character attached, and the unit got wiped with the character, you would get 2 miracle dice. Now, no matter how many die in a single phase, you're only going to get 1 miracle die. Again, I think that is a very positive change. And then the Triumphs rule was reworded so that it affects the battle round addition of miracle dice. And then we also have some detachment rules changes, like command points for Blazing Ire and Cleansing Flames going up to 2 points instead of 1. Some of the ranges on some of their abilities going down from 12 inches to 6 inches, just to kind of bring that back into balance. And then for Adeptus Custodes, the main changes that we saw here is essentially the Shield Captain on Dawn Eagle Jetbike. Toughness went up to 7 and wounds went up to 8. And then also the weapons have gotten better. The Salvo Launcher is now twin linked, strength 10, -3, d6 plus 1 damage. So much more effective, especially with that twin linked. And then also the Hurricane Bolters have changed, so they're now AP1 with 2 damage apiece. So we're now going to see those bikes dishing out quite a bit more damage. And then we also see the Veritas Praetors profile has changed. They are now toughness 7 with 5 wounds apiece. So bikes have gotten substantially better, and to reflect that, their points have went up as well. I do think they're now legitimately viable. Next, we see a couple changes to the Astra Militarum. So we see Lord Solar Leontis order section has been changed. He can now issue up to 3 orders to regiment units or squadron units. So it is restricted. You can't just pick anything in the game now. It is regiment or squadron only. That's still going to encompass the majority of units in the guard army. But if it doesn't have one of those 2 keywords, he can no longer issue them orders. And then we also see the Tempestus Equivalence rule has been changed to that 6-inch range, like we discussed earlier for the Deep Strike. And then also they can only drop in your movement phase and use this special ability. They can no longer use rapid ingress and then come outside of 3 inches. Now they're only going to be able to rapid ingress at 9 or regular Deep Strike outside of 6. We see Black Templars have some minimum changes. The Repulsor Executioner can now transport 7 models. The Crusader Squad melee weapons now have an AP characteristic of -1. The Chaos Knights Harbingers of Dread ability says each model from your army with this ability has the following Dread abilities, and then lists them off. We see Games Workshop has made some sweeping changes to how Objective Secure ability works. So previously, when you controlled an objective, it would remain under your control, typically with the wording of something like until the end of your opponent's turn or the end of the opponent's command phase. Now it just says until your opponent's level of control over the objective marker is greater than yours at the end of any phase. So essentially, you're just going to check to see if that objective is still under your control or if it's now under your opponent's control at the end of any phase rather than those very specific times. So much more in line with like the overall rules. The Trader's Mark ability is now within 12 inches of the bearer in your movement phase to force a battle shock test. The Dread Talons Chaos Space Marines rule is now 6 inches instead of the typical 3 inches, in line with the other changes we saw. And then we see a sweeping change for Chaos Predator Annihilators. So previously, Predator Annihilators rerolled 1s on the damage roll when targeting monsters or vehicles. Now they're going to reroll all their damage rolls. So substantially better, going from reroll 1s to reroll anything you want against monsters and vehicles. And then we see for demons, the Screamer's melee weapons have gone to anti-monster 4-up, anti-vehicle 4-up, and they now hit on 3s. So the Screamer's points have gone up a bit to reflect that. We see some pretty big changes to the Dark Angels. So the Masters of Maneuver Detachment rule, Adeptus Astartes mounted units from your army are eligible to shoot and declare a charge in a turn in which they advance or fell back. And then Master of Maneuver Enhancement, Ravenwing models only. You can reroll advance and charge rolls made for the bearer's unit. So now the Dark Angels Ravenwing are substantially better, and they're more inclined to take their own detachment rather than taking the generic detachment from the Space Marine Codex. They're going to be more likely to use the actual Ravenwing themed detachment. We also see big changes to Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the Dark Angels. His sweep attack is now 2 damage instead of 1. So big change, and again, his points have went up to reflect that. We see Ravenwing Black Knights now have devastating wounds. We see Samael, the Grandmaster of Ravenwing. His rule has been changed to if that unit is already eligible to shoot or declare a charge in a turn in which it advanced, add 1 to the advance and charge rolls made for this unit instead. So now essentially he used to grant the ability to shoot and charge. If your unit already has that ability from something else, like the Ravenwing Detachment, now you're going to add 1 to advance and charge rolls. So you don't feel like you're missing out on one of his special rules because your detachment rule is already granting it. Instead, it just upgrades to the next level of special rule. We also see changes to the Death Guard Predator in line with what we saw on the other Annihilator changes. And then we see Mortarion actually has the Deep Strike ability now, because obviously he has wings. A lot of the other Primarchs have Deep Strikes, so now Mortarion gets to join the crew with his wings being able to Deep Strike as well. And then we see some massive changes to the Genestealer Cult. So the Cult Ambush rule previously let you roll, and on a 4-up or a 5-up, your unit would get to come back at full strength. Now, instead of using those roll abilities, that is all gone. Instead, you're going to get a certain number of points that you can spend throughout the game to bring units back. So in your typical 2,000 point game, which is Strike Force, you're going to get 10 Resurgent points. And then essentially there's a chart here for what units you can bring back. So you can bring back Aberrants, either 5 models for 5 points or 10 models for 8 points. You can bring back Acolyte Hybrids, either 5 models for 2 points or 10 models for 4 points. You can bring back Jackals, 5 models for 3 points or 10 models for 6 points. You can bring back Hybrids, 10 models for 3 points or 20 models for 6 points. And then you can bring back Pure Stirring Genestealers, 5 models for 3 points or 10 models for 6 points. So for the most part, what this means is you're going to be able to pick one of these units on the list. You're going to bring one full strength unit back, and then you're going to be able to bring one half strength unit back. So on average now for a Genestealer Cults player, instead of bringing back like 3 to 6 units per game on average, you're going to be bringing back 1 big unit and 1 small unit. So massive nerf for the Genestealer Cult. We also see changes to their deep strike abilities, some minor changes to like the Outlander Claw ability, and then we see the Xenocreed Congregation Detachment. Now the enhancement Deeds That Speak to the Masses is going to give you 2 additional Resurgence points. So realistically, what that's going to mean is you have 10 Resurgence points normally. If you take this detachment and this enhancement, you'll now have 12. So you can bring back 2 full-size units instead of 1 full-size unit and 1 half-size unit. And then obviously with the deep strike rules changing, we see all of the Genestealer Cult hand flamers and then bombs have been changed from 6-inch range up to 8-inch range. So now you'll be able to deep strike outside of 6 and still shoot with them. We see the Imperial Agents Calyxus Assassin is now restricted to outside of 6 inches instead of outside of 3. Right in line with everything else. The Necrons Annihilation Legion Detachment now says each time a Destroyer Cult unit from your army makes a ranged attack that targets the closest eligible target, add 1 to the AP characteristic. We also see the Hypercrypt Legion Detachment. Previously in a Strike Force game, you could pick up 3 units per turn. Now you can only pick up 2. So essentially now you're going to have a little less optionality. We see a massive buff to the Orcs. Previously, the issue with the WA ability was, regardless of who got the first turn, you had to select whether or not you were going to WA at the beginning of the battle round. Now you're going to select it in your command phase. So there's a minor downside here, which means that if your opponent gets the first turn, you're not going to have had the ability to trigger that WA because previously you could have done it at the start of the battle round. Now you're not going to have it for that first turn, but then you're still going to have the optionality to choose whether or not to do it on each of your turns forward. So overall, it's a massive buff. The only downside is in the event of the first turn, your opponent gets first turn, and you wanted to trigger the wall on their turn, that's no longer going to be an option. But outside of that, it is a pure buff. Then we see a couple of other things like the Big Hunt Detachment. Now you have monsters, vehicles, and characters give you your bonuses. That one's even bigger, lets you reroll charge rolls made for your unit, provided one of the targets is your prey. And then also Goskol Thraka's ability has been changed, so that now you're going to add 1 to the hit roll and 1 to the wound roll. And if the WA is active for your army, critical hits are going to be scored on 5s. Now a quick word from today's sponsor, CMO Games. CMO Games carries a full range of Games Workshop products, including miniatures, paint, terrain, tools, and more. They take pre-orders for most Games Workshop new releases as early as possible, usually 12:01 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. CMO Games offers 15% off of MSRP for most all Games Workshop products and offer fast free shipping to the continental United States on orders over $50. Most orders ship out within 24 hours. You know their customer service is top-notch as they've been selling games online for over 20 years. Use the affiliate link below and let them know that Warhammer Man sent you. And then we have a ton of changes for Space Marines. So essentially now the Oath of Moment ability, if you're a chapter compliant army, is now going to grant you not only reroll hits on your Oath target, but you're going to get +1 to wound as well. So essentially that means you don't have any Black Templars, Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Death Watch, or Space Wolves. So if you pick your army out of the actual codex and not one of the codex supplements with no models from any of the supplements in it, you're going to get a special bonus. So that is essentially going to incentivize you to use chapter compliant chapters. Also, the Gladius Task Force Enhancement Fire Discipline no longer crits on 5s. Instead, it's going to grant you reroll advance rolls made for this unit. So basically, Fire Discipline is dead at this point in time. The Captain and Gravis Armor's range weapon has gone up to damage 3. And then each of the individual characters inside the Space Marine Codex now has a special buff. So essentially, Darnath Lysander says that all your non-character Terminator Assault Squads or Terminator Squads are going to go from OC1 to OC2. Iron Father Pharos is going to give all of your heavy intercessor units OC3 instead of OC2. Kyvan Shrike is going to give all your assault intercessors with jump packs OC2 instead of OC1. Corso Khan is going to give all of your Outriders units OC3 instead of OC2. And then Pedro Contour is going to give all your Stern Guard veteran units OC2 instead of OC1. We also have heavy intercessors, heavy bolt rifles going up to damage 2 from damage 1, and their heavy bolter going to ballistic seal 3. Their points have gone up to reflect these changes, as now their damage output is going to be substantially higher. We see Infernus squads now have AP 1 on their flamers, and again their points have gone up to reflect this. Infernus squads are now very good. Scepter squads now deep strike outside of 6 instead of outside 3. Infernus Marines, when they force you to take that battle shock test if they kill a model, are now going to subtract 1 from that battle shock test. And then we see a big change to intercessor squads as well. So now whenever you shoot with your intercessor squads, if you target a single unit, you're going to be able to add 2 to the attacks characteristic of their bolt rifles, which means that a 5-man intercessor unit is now going to have 20 shots. A 10-man intercessor unit is now going to have 40 shots at strength 4, AP 1, 1 damage. So intercessors are amazing. The Predator Annihilator now rerolls damage rules just like all the other Predator Annihilators. And then we see some changes to Reavers and combat knives. So Reavers points have gone up slightly. They have changed the Fearsome Assault rule to actually combine the Terror Troops and Fearsome Assault rule. So now at the beginning of the fight phase, your opponent still has to take a Battle Shock test at -1. But now the Terror Troops rule is a second rule, which is now if a monster or vehicle unit is within 3 inches, you subtract 1 from their objective control characteristic. So essentially, Reavers are now going to take stuff from 1 OC down to 0 or 2 OC down to 1. And then they're still going to have the ability to Battle Shock stuff as well. So they're going to be able to take objectives away very easily. The Repulsor Executioner has gone up to 7 transport capacity. Rabute Guilliman now lets you choose 2 of the Codex abilities instead of just 1, and his points have gone up like 60 points to reflect this, but he is still very good. Sternguard Veterans now reroll wounds against your Oath of Moment target, not just reroll wounds of 1. All of the combat blades and combat knives are now AP -1. So combat knives on the captain in Phobos armor, lieutenant in Reaver armor, and Reaver squad, as well as scout squad, are all AP1. Paired combat blades in Incursor squads, lieutenants in Phobos armor, and lieutenants with combi weapons are now all AP1. So again, very good. Suddenly all these guys that had 0 AP are all 1 AP, and it makes a massive difference. And then for Tyranids, we have the Assimilation Swarm Detachment, Feed the Swarm Detachment rule. In your command phase, each harvester unit from your army can regenerate 1 friendly Tyranid unit that is within 6 inches. And now 1 model in that unit is going to regain a D3 plus 1 lost wounds. We also see the Norn Assimilator has gained the Harvester keyword, which means he's going to be affected by that rule. We also see some points drops on the Norns as well that are going to make them even more viable. And then finally, for World Eaters, we see that the World Eater Demon Prince Infernal Fortitude ability now grants you a 5+ invulnerable save, but if you already had a 5+ invulnerable save, you're going to go to a 4+ invulnerable save. And then again, Predator Annihilator changes as well. So massive amount of changes. Obviously, the biggest and most impactful ones are on Space Marines here. Space Marines have gotten a massive buff if they're a Codex compliant chapter. We also see a lot of the Ultramarine stuff has gone up in points. So it's not going to break Ultramarines because they were already the most powerful of the Codex compliant chapters. We see some buffs to some of the other Space Marine stuff, like the AP1 on the combat knives, the +1 to wound with the Oath ability, but then we see a debuff in the Armor of Contempt strat, and then the outside of 3-inch deep strike rule. We see a massive nerf to Genestealer Cults, a really big buff to Orcs with their WoW rule. We see some points changes to reflect everything. And overall, we're going to have to see how this all shakes out. Like anything with this many changes all at once, it's going to be tough to tell where the meta is going to land. I definitely think this helps Codex compliant Space Marines a lot. It's going to help Orcs a lot too. And then it's going to hurt Genestealer Cults a lot. We've got a bunch of new detachments. There's a bunch of big shakeups here. So let me know what you guys think of the new rules. Obviously, we're going to sort out some other stuff as we have more time to look at it. But in my opinion, right now, I know Games Workshop is trying to balance the game and keep it fresh, but I think they just did way too much in the month of December. Part of the problem with making this many changes all at once is it's going to be hard for them to understand which changes have broken certain units or what changes have completely screwed over certain armies. I think when you do this much stuff at once, it's hard to figure out exactly what the issue is, and it's going to take quite a while for the meta to settle. So let me know what you think the biggest changes are, what you think is good, what you think is bad. Always like to hear back from you guys in the comments. And as always, special thanks to CMO Games for sponsoring the channel. Check out the link in the description to save 15% on most Games Workshop products. And make sure to tell them that Warhammer Man sent you. Warhammer Man Studios, I'm Warhammer Man. And I'm glad Games Workshop is making some changes, but this is just way too much. And I'm out of here.